Before we begin, if you are someone who enjoys forgotten history, someone who believes that certain stories deserve to be remembered, go ahead and press the like button right now before you even finish watching, because what you are about to see is the kind of story you will wish you had already liked. Welcome to Lens of History. And one question for you in the comments. Who is the most famous black person in history that you know? Write a name, any name at all. Now let us begin. Jefferson County, Florida, August 1859. The sun had not yet cleared the tall pine trees when Caleb carried his third log of the morning, 200 pounds of wet oak, across his shoulders. His bare feet knew every root and every stone along that narrow path. 9 years had carved the routine into his muscles like a second skeleton inside his body. Sometimes he closed his eyes just to prove he could, just to feel for 30 seconds as if the forest belonged to him alone. It never lasted longer than those 30 seconds. He dropped the log onto the stack without making a sound and reached for the next one. Caleb. Junior's voice. 16 years old. Hands still soft. Eyes already tired and old. He stood at the edge of the clearing, not really looking at Caleb, but staring past him toward the line of trees. Reed's coming. That was enough. Overseer Thomas Reed came out from the pines on his bay mare, moving with the slow and unhurried pace of a man who had never once been forced to hurry. He always rode, even when the distance was only 20 feet. He said the horse was for speed. The truth was simpler. A man on horseback never has to look up. Reed was compact and pale, somewhere around 40. Rust-colored whiskers and small eyes the color of swamp water. He almost never raised his voice. He spoke quietly, almost gently, which was worse than shouting because it meant he was not angry. It meant he was comfortable. He stopped about 10 feet from Junior and looked down at him the way someone looks at arithmetic they have already solved. "You were 3 pounds short last night." Junior swallowed. "Sir, That was not a question." He dismounted the way men do when they believe they own the ground beneath their boots. Slow, certain, final. He unhooked the short whip from his belt, not the long cattle whip, the short one with the braided metal tip. Junior did not run. Junior had learned that running only made Reed smile. The first blow landed across his shoulder. The second struck the middle of his back. Junior clenched his jaw and fixed his eyes on the dirt between his feet because he had also learned, through pain, that eye contact was an invitation. Third blow. Fourth. Caleb set down his axe and stepped forward. Enough. The clearing fell silent, the way everything goes silent when something irreversible has just been spoken. Every axe froze halfway through a swing. No one breathed. Somewhere high in the trees a bird stopped calling in the middle of a note, as if even the wildlife understood that something had shifted. Reed slowly turned his head. "What did you say?" "The boy weighed right," Caleb said. His voice was steady, not loud, not soft. The voice of a man stating a simple fact he would not argue about. "The scales at the South Barn run 3 pounds low. I checked them myself. Both of those things were true. Neither of them mattered." Reed stepped toward him and lifted the whip. Caleb caught his wrist. He did not squeeze it. He did not twist it. He did not turn it into a fight. He simply closed his hand around Reed's forearm and stopped the motion. The way someone stops a door from closing. The way someone holds something they have not yet decided what to do with. He held it for 3 full seconds, long enough for Reed to understand how little effort it required. Then Caleb let go. Reed stepped back. He picked up the whip from where it had fallen between them, returned it to his belt, mounted his horse, without looking at anyone, and rode out of the clearing at the same slow pace he had arrived with. No threats, no last words. That was how Caleb knew it was serious. Junior stared at him. "Why?" he whispered. Not accusation. Not gratitude. Just the confused voice of someone trying to understand a language he had never heard spoken before. "Go to the creek," Caleb said. "Put your back in the water." He picked up his axe and returned to work. By noon, Caleb knew they would come before nightfall. He kept working, log after log, hour after hour. The rhythm lived so deeply inside his body that it required nothing from his mind, that left his thoughts free to do what they needed to do, to think clearly, without panic, about what was coming and what could possibly be done about it. Each time he reached the same answer: nothing, not today. A few men caught his eye and quickly looked away, not with judgment, but with the special fear of people who had learned that standing near trouble was its own kind of danger. He understood it. Years earlier he had done the same thing. Made himself invisible, looked at the ground, felt grateful it was not him. He had stopped feeling grateful for that a long time ago. They arrived with an hour of daylight left, 4 men, 2 of Reed's white hands and 2 Caleb knew by name, Sam and Clay. Both avoided looking at him. Both stood stiffly like men following an order they had not chosen. "Master wants you." Caleb walked ahead of them without being told. Not because he could not fight. He could have put all 4 of them on the ground, and they knew it. That was exactly why they had sent 4. He walked because fighting now would make someone else pay, someone who could not carry that cost, someone like Junior. There were always people like Junior. Edward Holloway received him on the veranda as the last sunlight turned the cotton fields copper red. The master of Holloway Plantation was tall and silver-haired, with the careful posture of a man who had made every decision of his life from a position of complete certainty and had never once needed to reconsider it. A glass of bourbon sat on the table beside him. An unlit cigar rolled slowly between his fingers. Reed stood 1 step behind him, and slightly to the right, positioned like a shadow that had learned obedience. Holloway studied Caleb the way someone studies something they paid a great deal of money for and are now deciding whether it should be repaired or thrown away. The silence stretched. "You put your hands on my man," Holloway finally said. I stopped his arm. "Same thing on this property." He lifted his glass, drank, and set it down again with the calm patience of a man who had nowhere he needed to be. $900, he said. "That is roughly what you cost me at the current market." Good timber worker, strong back, 8 years of reliable labor. He paused. "I have owned horses I was less fond of." Caleb said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was the only weapon he possessed in rooms like this, and he used it carefully. "Reed wants you hanged," Holloway continued, speaking like a man discussing a small disagreement over paperwork. I overruled him. "Hanging wastes capital." He stood and adjusted the front of his jacket. "Besides, I have always believed the natural world provides a more elegant solution than rope." He turned toward the door. "Take him into the swamp," he told Reed without looking back. "Past the second cypress break where the ground turns soft." He paused in the doorway. "Do not hurry back." They rode for an hour into the dark. Caleb's wrists were tied behind him. His ankles were bound close enough to allow only small steps. 4 horses, no lanterns. The trail narrowed as the pine forest thinned and gave way to cypress. The ground changed beneath his feet like a sentence changing its meaning. Sand became packed clay. Clay turned into soft black peat that swallowed each step to the ankle and released it with a slow wet sound. Caleb watched everything. He memorized every detail with the intense focus of a man who does not yet know which detail will matter, but understands that any of them might. The angle of the stars above the canopy, the direction the night birds flew, the way the air changed, heavier, warmer, thick with the smell of water and living plants as the trees grew closer together and their roots disappeared beneath dark, still pools. The cypress swamp began where the last solid ground ended. The trees rose from the water like the pillars of a drowned cathedral, ancient and enormous. Their knees pushed above the surface in twisted shapes. Gray moss hung from every branch in long curtains that brushed the water. Somewhere high in the darkness a creature screamed once, one sharp, clear note. Then the swamp swallowed the sound and returned nothing. They stopped where the earth ended. Ahead of them lay black water, perfectly still. The dark columns of cypress disappeared into a darkness so complete it almost looked solid. Reed dismounted. He walked toward Caleb and stopped close enough that Caleb could smell tobacco, leather, and the sour edge of a man who had spent the entire day feeling insulted. "Nobody comes out of this part," Reed said quietly. "Not by themselves." He waited a moment. Gaiters, moccasins, sinkholes you cannot see until you are already standing in them, underground currents that can pull you sideways, fever from the water in 3 days if nothing else gets you first. He tilted his head slightly. "I want you to understand there is nothing heroic about this. This is simply geography." Caleb looked at him calmly. "You have been afraid of me since this morning," Caleb said. "That is why there are 4 of you." Something flickered across Reed's face, quick, small, like something flinching behind a wall. He struck Caleb across the face with a closed fist, putting the full weight of his shoulder behind it, hard enough that a weaker man would have fallen to his knees. Caleb's head turned, with the blow. Then he slowly turned it back and looked at Reed again. Reed stepped back and glanced at his own hand briefly, as if it had surprised him. "Put him in," he said. The water was warm, not river warm, not the clean, moving cold of deep current. This was different, thick and still, holding heat the way a fever holds heat, the way something living and sick holds heat. Caleb went completely under when they shoved him from the bank. He felt something soft beneath his feet at the bottom, pushed away from it, and broke the surface. He heard the horses leaving, hooves on wet ground fading slowly into the distance. Then silence. He rolled onto his back, the only position possible with his wrists tied, and looked up through the cypress branches at the night sky. The stars were bright and countless through the gaps in the trees. Out of habit he found the North Star and fixed his eyes on it. Something moved to his left. He did not react. He simply turned his head with the careful calm of a man who understood that panic was just another way to die. Someone who understood that this water had its own language, and that a sudden movement was like a word in that language he could not risk speaking. About 12 feet away, 2 ridges rested just above the waterline, completely still like stones, only the eyes and nostrils visible. The alligator watched it with the ancient bored patience of a creature that had stayed at the top of its food chain since long before men learned to build fires. Caleb stayed perfectly still. Then he slowly began to move. Careful, quiet, no splash, no hurry. Drifting in the opposite direction. The ridges did not follow him. He reached a cypress knee, hooked his legs over the root arch, and pulled himself partly out of the water, rubbing his wrists against the sharp bark edge in the darkness. Nearly 20 minutes of slow, steady sawing passed before the rope finally frayed and snapped. He freed his ankles, stood upright on the root, and looked out across the swamp. Water, trees, and darkness in every direction as far as anything seemed to exist. He breathed in slowly through his nose, deep and steady. Then he started listening. Really listening, the way a person listens when life depends not on strength, but on careful attention. The swamp was not silent at all. It was thick with sound. Frogs calling in overlapping rhythms, insects forming heavy walls of noise, water dripping from hanging moss, something large moving far to the north, something smaller breaking the surface about 8 feet to his right, a bird calling in the east in a repeated pattern, 3 notes. A pause. Then 3 notes again. He began sorting the sounds in his mind, almost reading them. Loud frogs meant shallower water. The thickest mosquitoes meant dry ground somewhere nearby. That bird in the east was perched on something solid. He climbed down from the root and started moving, one slow step at a time, testing the swamp floor before shifting his weight, searching for firmness beneath the dark water. He was not fighting the swamp. Instead, he was asking it quiet questions, and for the first time, it seemed to answer. Just before midnight, he found a hammock, a small raised island of land about 6 feet across, wrapped in ferns, firm under his feet and almost invisible unless you knew how to notice it. He pulled himself onto it, and leaned back against a cypress trunk. His face ached where Reed had struck him. His wrists were raw and bleeding. His legs felt heavy in a way that went beyond tired muscles, but he was breathing. In the morning he would begin learning. In the morning he would start to understand what this place truly was and what it might become. That was the first night. There were 20 more ahead of him. On the second morning he ate a frog, raw and whole, still moving when he caught it. He did not think about it. Thinking was the luxury of a man who had choices, and Caleb had none. He bit down, chewed twice, swallowed, then sat quietly for a moment, with his hands resting on his knees while he stared at the water. Then he caught another frog. That was when Caleb understood the first rule of the swamp. The swamp did not care about dignity. It only cared about one simple question: whether you would still be alive tomorrow morning. Everything else meant nothing. He spent the first 3 days learning the shape and rhythm of the place, not exploring. Exploring suggested boldness and confidence, the forward movement of a man carrying a map. Caleb had none of that. Instead, he did something smaller and far more patient. He sat perfectly still for hours, letting the swamp move around him until he became just another piece of its furniture. Soon he realized the swamp had a pulse. At dawn, the birds flew east, toward higher ground where the cypress trees thinned. That meant east led to dry land, maybe a ridge, maybe a bank. He remembered that detail carefully. At midday, the alligators retreated into the same 3 channels, the ones with the deepest shadows. He memorized those channels, learning their curves and shapes. 2 of them connected, and the narrow space between them formed a hidden sandbar that ran diagonally northeast. It was shallow enough to cross if you moved slowly and kept your balance forward. At dusk, the water moccasins appeared. Caleb watched them for 2 full evenings from his hammock before touching one. The snake was about 3 feet long, thick as his forearm, curled on a root arch 10 feet away. Its mouth was pale cream-colored, the white that gave it the name cottonmouth. Its venom was fast and aggressive, rotting flesh around the bite before stopping tea. He-heart. Caleb studied how it moved, how its body looked when calm, and how it subtly changed when threatened. There was always a slight tightening, a shift in the neck when danger was near. He watched it the way a fighter studies an opponent, not to defeat it, but to understand the exact moment when it would strike. On the 3rd evening, he slowly reached forward and placed 2 fingers on its back. The snake froze. He kept his fingers there for 5 seconds, then gently pulled them away. The snake uncoiled and slid silently into the water. Caleb let out a slow breath. That was when he realized something important. Fear was a kind of transaction. You gave it to something, and in return it owned you. The swamp was built entirely on that exchange. Every creature in it, predator and prey, shaped its life around fear. The ones that survived the longest were not the strongest or the fastest. They were the ones who chose carefully what deserved their fear. Caleb decided to stop making that exchange. He chose to stop being afraid, not in a reckless way, not for show, but in a quiet, structural way. Like deciding to stop carrying a heavy object after realizing you had held it so long you forgot it was not part of your body. He set that weight down, and something in the swamp almost seemed to notice. By the end of the first week, he had mapped nearly 300 yards of passable water routes. He knew where the roots made firm ground, where the channels could be crossed, where natural bridges formed between trees, so that someone who knew the path could move quickly. Someone who did not know would sink chest deep and stop moving entirely. Caleb thought about that often, almost like an architect thinking about a building that had not yet been built. On the 5th day, he discovered fresh water. It came from a natural seep where groundwater pushed upward through a crack in the limestone E-shelf beneath the swamp. The water ran clear and cold into a pool no larger than a wash basin, hidden beneath a mat of watercress that filtered it clean. He drank from it for a long time, then sat back and looked at it thoughtfully. In 9 years on the Holloway plantation, he had never once controlled his own water. He stayed there a long time thinking about that fact. His shelter slowly formed during the second week. It was not a structure, nothing that looked built or announced a human presence. Instead, it was a series of quiet arrangements. A cypress knee placed here, a bundle of tied reeds there, moss pressed into gaps, water directed away from his sleeping ground through a shallow trench he dug with a flat stone. It was invisible from 20 feet away, even invisible from 10, unless you knew its shape. He began eating properly. Frogs, crayfish, and small fish caught by hand in the shallow water at dawn. He moved so slowly the fish did not see him as a threat until his fingers closed around them. He found turtle eggs in a nest discovered on the third day, but left untouched until he secured another food source, so he would not destroy the first. Near the hammock's eastern edge, he discovered early muscadine grapes growing along a vine that climbed a dead cypress tree. His body changed, though not quickly and not dramatically. It was not the kind of change found in stories where a man enters hardship and emerges larger than life. This was something more specific. The softness disappeared. The hesitation faded. The particular way his body had learned to move on the plantation, slightly inward, slightly smaller, the physical habit of a man who had spent 9 years trying not to be noticed, slowly vanished. He stood differently. He walked differently. Caleb had always been physically strong. That was why Holloway valued him at $900. Why Reed had C meant 4 men instead of 2. Why the horse had shifted nervously when Caleb stood too close. But strength without control is simply energy waiting for direction. What the swamp gave him was something else entirely: precision. The understanding that the most dangerous creatures in the water were not the largest ones. They were the ones that never moved unless they were certain. He found the others on the 13th day. He smelled smoke first, a thin thread, drifting carefully through the cypress trees. It was the kind of smoke made by someone who understood the danger of being seen. He followed it for 2 hours, moving with the same careful steps he had learned, testing the water's depth before placing his weight down. He heard them before he saw them, 3 voices, quiet and cautious, suddenly stopping the moment he came close. Then silence, the tight, coiled silence of people who understood that one wrong sound at the wrong moment could mean death. Caleb stopped at the edge of the tree line and stood completely still. "I'm not Reed," he said quietly. "I'm not anyone's man." There was a long pause. Then a voice answered, older and female, steady as oak wood. "Step where we can see you." He stepped forward. 5 people stood on a hammock, larger than his. A man in his 50s with a deep scar running from his left ear down to his jaw. A young woman holding a sleeping infant close to her chest. 2 teenage boys sitting back to back, as if someone had told them to stay that way. And the older woman whose voice he had heard, sitting on a root with the calm stillness of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything long ago. They studied him. He studied them. "How long?" Caleb asked quietly. 6 weeks, the woman replied. "We know this section of the swamp, the deep part. Holloway's men never come past the second cypress break. They don't know the crossings," Caleb said. Her eyes sharpened immediately. "You found the crossings." 3 of them, he answered after a moment. Then he added, "There's a 4th one north-northeast. You've been here 6 weeks and haven't found it because it runs close to the moccasin channel." Most people stop looking once they see the snakes. Silence settled over them. The older woman looked at him the way someone might examine a tool whose purpose she did not yet understand. Slowly, carefully, without committing to any judgment. "What's your name?" she asked. "Caleb Holloway's." There was a pause. Something changed in her expression. Not softness exactly, but a kind of recognition, like the look of someone finally hearing words they had been waiting a long time to hear spoken aloud. "I'm Nora," she said. "Sit. Eat something." She offered him a piece of dried fish. He accepted it, sat down on the root beside her, and began to eat. For a while neither of them spoke. The swamp shifted quietly around them. Frogs calling, insects humming, the soft sound of water touching the roots of old trees. The infant slept. The 2 teenage boys, watched Caleb with the careful attention of people deciding whether someone deserved their trust. He did not try to convince them. Trust gained that way was fragile. They would decide when they were ready. "You're going back," Nora said. It was not a question. Caleb looked across the water. Yes. When? He thought about the crossings he had mapped, the moccasin channels and their exact timing, the paths through the deep swamp that looked impossible but were not, the things he had learned in 13 days that Reed and Holloway did not even know existed and would never travel far enough into the darkness to discover. He thought about Junior's face, about the sound of the whip, about Holloway's voice saying, "Nature is considerably happier than rope," in the calm, casual tone of a man who had never once in his life been forced to face the consequences of his own certainty. "Not yet," Caleb said. He picked up a flat stone from the ground and turned it slowly in his hands. "There's more to learn first." He continued learning for 7 more days. He learned which plants along the edge of the water produced sap that, when slowly reduced over a small fire, became a thick paste that caused the muscles of a large animal, or a man, to lock completely within minutes if it touched broken skin. He discovered this by watching what happened when a nutria rat brushed against a certain vine and then sat very still for a long time afterward. He learned the route the water moccasins followed each night, a specific channel running northeast to southwest, beginning at the base of the split cypress he had been using as a landmark and ending at a submerged log near the eastern edge of the swamp, predictable as a clock. Patient the way everything in this place seemed patient. He learned that the alligators in the deepest channel had a limit. Below a certain level of disturbance, they stayed where they were. Above it, they moved toward the sound. It was not exactly aggression. It was curiosity, the instinct of an animal that had learned over millions of years that movement in its water often meant food, but curiosity and aggression reached the same ending. He stored all of it in his mind. 18 days. 19 days. On the evening of the 20th day, he sat in his hammock and looked east, toward the direction of the Holloway plantation, and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite calm. Something in the space between the two, something cold and clear and exact, like the moment before you swing an axe, when you already know exactly where it will land and all that remains is the motion itself. He turned to Nora. "Tomorrow," he said. She nodded once. She had been expecting it. "How many people are still on that plantation?" he asked. 43, she replied. "Last time I counted, 43. He turned that number over in his thoughts the way he had turned a flat stone, feeling its weight. "Then we're not leaving anyone behind," he said. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face. Complicated. Layered. The expression of someone who had hoped for something for so long they were no longer certain. They believed it could happen. "You sound very sure," she said. Caleb looked back toward the east. "I know every inch of this water," he said quietly. "I know where it's shallow and where it will swallow a man whole. I know where the snakes are. I know where the gators stay." He paused, "and they don't know any of it." He picked up the flat stone again and then set it down. "That swamp out there is the most dangerous thing in Jefferson County," he said. "It always has been. They just never understood that danger could work both ways." The small fire between them burned low. The swamp continued its quiet sounds. Somewhere to the north, something large moved through the water with slow, patient purpose. Caleb closed his eyes. "Tomorrow." He left before dawn. Nora tried to give him the dried fish again. He told her to keep it. She pushed it into his hand anyway, the way women sometimes do when they have already decided the argument is finished, and he accepted it without another word. The 2 teenage boys, Marcus and Eli, were awake when he left. They said nothing. Marcus gave him a single nod, the kind that means "I see what you're doing and I will remember it." Eli stared out at the water. Caleb understood both reactions. He moved east through the darkness. He knew the path by feeling now, left at the split cypress, diagonal across the hidden sandbar. Right forward, feet wide, a sharp right before the moccasin channel. Wait. Listen. Cross only when the water is still. Then through the shallow passage behind the dead Tupelo, where the bottom was firm limestone, and the water barely reached his knees, up onto the ridge of higher ground where the pines began, again, and the air grew drier and thinner, and finally smelled like the world he had come from. He stopped at the ridgeline and stood among the pines, looking east toward the plantation, 1.5 miles, maybe 2. He could smell the wood smoke from cooking fires. He could see faint orange pinpoints of lantern light where the overseers made their rounds. He stood there for a long time, not hesitating, just looking. Then he stepped off the ridge and moved toward the light. He entered the quarter just before the 3 o'clock bell. The cabins were dark and silent, the plantation wrapped in that particular nighttime stillness that was less like sleep and more like collective breath-holding. The quiet habit of survival that 43 people had learned to perform every night, because making too much sound after dark brought the wrong kind of attention. He walked to the third cabin on the left and knocked twice, paused, then once more. There was a long silence, then the careful sound of someone moving inside, avoiding the floorboard near the door that creaked. The door opened 3 inches. Junior's face appeared in the gap, wide-eyed, the look of someone seeing something that should not exist. "They said you were dead," Junior whispered. "They were wrong," Caleb said. "Let me in." There were 4 people inside. Junior, an older man named Moses, who had worked in the Holloway smithy for 30 years. A woman named Celia, who cooked for the main house, and her daughter Grace, 17, quiet, with the careful, watchful eyes of someone who had learned to see everything. Gian revealed nothing. They stared at Caleb the way people look at someone who has returned from the dead, which in a way he had. He sat on the floor and looked at each of them one by one. "I'm not here to talk long," he said. "I need to know 3 things. The patrol routes, the weapons in the main house, and who among the 43 will walk when the time comes." Moses made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a cough. "Boy," he said, his voice carrying the roughness of a man who had survived by swallowing every sharp word he ever wanted to speak. "You've been gone 20 days. You walk back in here like you're planning a—" He stopped and shook his head. "They will kill everyone in this quarter if something goes wrong." "Yes," Caleb said. "They will." He said it without flinching, without drama, simply acknowledging the exact weight of what he was suggesting. "That's why nothing goes wrong." Silence filled the room. Moses studied him, his face, his hands, the way he sat now, different from before. Everyone in the cabin could feel it, even if they could not name it. Something had shifted in the structure of him. "What happened to you in that swamp?" Moses asked. Caleb thought about the snake, the alligator, 20 days of learning a language most men never lived long enough to understand. The moment he had set down his fear like a stone and walked away from it. "I learned something," he said. "What?" "That this county has one thing in it that's more dangerous than Holloway," Caleb replied quietly. "And it's been sitting 2 miles west of his land the entire time." Moses watched him for a long moment. Then slowly he sat down across from him. "Patrol routes," Moses said. "East fence, 2 men. 40-minute rotation. North side, 1 man. Reed takes it himself some nights. South side is light. 1 man, older, half asleep by midnight. Weapons in T. He main house." Celia added quietly, 2 rifles above the fireplace. "Holloway keeps his pistol on him after dark. Reed carries a knife and the whip. The other 4 hands keep firearms in the bunkhouse at the south end." Caleb stored every detail in his mind. "Who walks?" he asked. There was a pause. He asked. There was a pause. Moses and Celia exchanged a glance, the silent communication of people who had survived in the same tight space for a long time. "Most of them," Celia said softly. Her voice was low and careful, shaped by years of speaking in rooms where the wrong word spoken too loudly could destroy everything. "Most of them walk every night, in their minds while they sleep." She paused. "They just need to believe the door is real." Caleb nodded and turned to Grace. She had not spoken since he entered. She had been watching him with those quiet eyes, observing everything and giving nothing back. "What about you?" he asked. She paused for a long moment. "I've been waiting for something like this," she said. "Since I was 12 years old." She said it simply, without drama. The most frightening kind of certainty. He made his first move that night. Not against people. Not yet. He moved against the land itself. 3 hours before dawn, alone, he worked along the path between the eastern edge of the swamp and the plantation's western fence, marking the safe crossings with signs, invisible to anyone who did not know the code. A certain arrangement of stones, a reed broken at a specific height, moss cleared from the ground in a particular pattern, a trail that 43 people could follow in the darkness without speaking, without lanterns moving fast enough to matter and quiet enough to vanish. He tested the path twice, adjusted it, then tested again. After that, he moved toward the moccasin channel. What he did there took 2 hours dot, and it demanded a kind of patience so complete it almost felt like a real thing. Something he could hold in his hands, weigh carefully, and spend little by little. He worked with flat stones and bundles of reeds, building nothing that could be seen from above, nothing that looked planned. But the movement of the channels slowly changed, gently redirected. The snakes, pushed away from their usual path, spread into the shallower water to the north, exactly where anyone chasing a group of escaping people through the swamp's western path would step. He stepped back and studied what he had made. It did not look like anything at all. That was the whole idea. 4 nights later, Reed vanished. Nobody on the plantation saw when it happened. Nobody in the swamp saw it either. One evening he was making his usual patrol along the north fence, and then suddenly he was not there anymore. By morning his horse had returned alone, and Holloway had sent 2 men to search. They came back pale and uneasy, unwilling to explain clearly what they had discovered. They only said the swamp had taken on him, and that they were not going back in to collect whatever remained. Holloway stood on his veranda that morning and stared west toward the cypress line for a long while. At 7 in the morning he poured himself a glass of bourbon and drank it while standing still. Caleb watched him from the tree line. He had been watching for 4 days, learning Holloway's habits the same way he had studied the alligator's limits, the snake's schedule, and the water's depth by the sound it made beneath his feet. Holloway was a man of strict routine. Same veranda, same bourbon, same cigar. Now the cigar was lit in the morning instead of just resting unlit, a small sign of a man whose calm control was starting to cost him something. He was scared. Good. Fear was like a trade, and Holloway was spending it quickly. On the 6th night, one of the workers, a young man named Garrett, not yet 20, and hired only 2 months earlier, walked to the well after midnight and never returned. On the 7th night, the older guard from the south fence leaned back against a post to rest his eyes for a moment and woke 12 hours later shaking with cold sweat, unable to remember anything that had happened in between. His head hurt for 4 days afterward. He had not been injured, only taken away for a short time. The difference mattered to Caleb. He was careful about that difference. By the 8th night, the remaining workers were sleeping in pairs and refusing to patrol alone. Holloway had sent a rider to the nearest town, asking for help. The rider came back 2 days later with 3 more men who looked at the situation, 4 disappearances, 1 guard who could not explain his missing hours, and a swamp that seemed to swallow people, and they demanded double the pay. Holloway agreed. He was not the kind of man who liked paying double for anything. Caleb, watching from the tree line, allowed hymns, elf, the smallest hint of a smile. He met Grace on the 9th night. She waited behind the cookhouse the way they had planned, standing with her arms folded in the darkness like she had already been there for hours, and was ready to stay there for hours more if needed. "It is time," he said. "How many nights?" she asked. "1, we leave tomorrow." She looked at him carefully. "All 43. All 43. She slowly unfolded her arms and nodded once. For a very brief moment, so quick it almost disappeared before it began, something opened in her face. Not fear. The opposite of fear. The look of someone who has held their breath, so long they forgot what it felt like to breathe out. "I will tell them," she said. "Tell them to bring nothing that makes noise. Tell them to follow the person ahead of them and not stop for any reason. Tell them," he paused, "tell them the swamp is safe. Tell them I know the path." She looked at him one more time. "Do you?" she asked. Not with doubt, just the simple, direct question of someone who needed to hear it spoken. "Every inch of it," Caleb said. She turned and walked back toward the quarters. He returned to the swamp before the first light of morning. Nora was awake, sitting beside the cold ashes of the fire, as if she had been waiting in exactly that place since he left. "Tomorrow night," he said. She looked up at him. In the darkness, most of her face was hidden, but her eyes caught the little light that existed and held it. "How many?" she asked. 43 plus the 5 of us. 48 total." A long, quiet moment passed. "Holloway will chase them," she said. "Yes, and with the new men, and probably dogs." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "And you are not afraid of that?" Caleb sat across from her with his forearms resting on his knees and looked out at the dark water. "You know what Holloway does not understand," he said. "He thinks the swamp is just an obstacle, something standing between him and what he is chasing." Caleb picked up a stone and turned it slowly in his hand. "He will follow 48 people into 2 miles of water and darkness, and he will bring his dogs and his rifles, believing those things are enough." Caleb placed the stone back down. Those things were enough everywhere else he had ever been. The swamp rested quietly around them. Frogs called in the distance. Water moved softly, the slow, patient sounds of a place that had existed 10,000 years before Edward Holloway, and would still be there 10,000 years after him. "Get some sleep," Caleb said. "Tomorrow we bring everyone home." They stepped out of their cabins one by one like shadows, slowly remembering how to walk. No lanterns, no voices. 43 people moving through the quarters in the deep silence of those who understand that one small sound at the wrong moment could decide everything. Children carried by their mothers, pressed tightly against shoulders, faces hidden in cloth. Old Moses, with his bad knee, moved slower than the rest, but he kept moving, jaw tight, eyes forward. 30 years of swallowed anger finally given a direction. Grace walked down the line, touching shoulders. One touch each. "Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going." Caleb stood at the western fence and counted them as they slipped through the opening he had made 3 nights earlier. He pulled each person through by the hand and pointed them west toward the tree line. 1, 2, 7, 15, 22. He counted every face. 31, 38, 43. He went through last. The swamp received them in darkness so deep it almost had texture, like something pressing softly against the face, something alive and breathing. A few people stopped at the water's edge without meaning to. Caleb had expected this. He moved quietly back along the line, calm and steady, too. Touching an arm here, a shoulder there. "Trust the bottom," he whispered. "Step where I step. Do not stop." Then he stepped into the water. After a moment, the person behind him followed. Then the next. Then all of them. He led them exactly the way he had practiced in his mind, 100 times. The diagonal crossing, leaning forward, feet wide. Turn left at the split cypress, whose shape was barely visible against the sky. Pass behind the dead tupelo, where the limestone shelf stayed firm underfoot. He moved at the speed of the slowest person, which was Moses, and he never rushed him. He never showed impatience, and never looked back with anything that might look like doubt. A leader who shows fear is a leader who loses people. The water was warm around their legs. Cypress knees rose from the dark like frozen shapes. Someone's child made a soft sound, not quite a cry, quickly quieted, and the line held together. Halfway across, Caleb stopped and lifted one hand. The line stopped behind him. 43 people standing in black water in perfect silence. He listened. 30 seconds, 60 seconds. A night heron called once somewhere to the north. The sound faded. Then nothing. Caleb lowered his hand and walked forward again. They reached Nora's hammock. 2 hours before dawn. The small island was not large enough for 48 people, but they managed it by sitting close together, and standing along the edges. The infants and children rested in the middle. Nora moved among them with the quiet control of someone who knew how to turn confusion into order. Marcus and Eli helped people climb onto the higher ground, steadying the elderly and catching anyone who stumbled. Nobody spoke louder than a whisper. Caleb stood at the eastern edge of the hammock watching the direction they had come from. Grace stepped beside him. "Everyone is here," she said softly. "I know," he replied. A pause. He passed between them. "What happens now?" she asked. "We wait for them to notice," Caleb said. "They will notice at first light, when the cook fires stay cold and the quarters do not wake up." He kept watching the darkness. "Holloway will come himself. He will not send men alone after what happened this week. He will bring all of them together, and the dogs, bloodhounds, follow scent on the ground." Caleb looked at the water surrounding the island on every side. "There is no ground here." Grace stayed quiet for a moment. "You planned all of this from the beginning?" she asked. Caleb thought about that, about the 20 days he had spent lying awake in the dark, listening to the swamp breathe, slowly learning its patterns, slowly realizing that every trap and danger that had almost killed him could be understood in reverse, could become something else entirely for the right people moving in the right direction. "The swamp planned it," he said. "I only paid attention." The shouting began at sunrise. They heard it across the water. At first, it was faint, just the shape of voices moving through the cypress trees. Then it grew clearer. Then came a sound. Everyone on the hammock knew so well they felt it in their bodies before their minds recognized it. Holloway's voice, loud and furious. Voice, loud and furious. The voice of a man whose certainty had just collided with something he could not explain. Nobody on the hammock moved. Nora sat with a sleeping infant in her lap and stared quietly ahead. Moses kept his eyes closed. 2 teenage boys sat shoulder to shoulder watching the eastern water, trying very hard to keep their faces blank. Caleb listened to the shouting and understood it like a map. First the east fence, someone discovering the gap, then voices moving south toward the tree line. A whistle, 2 short blasts, and 1 long. That meant dogs. The bloodhounds began barking a few minutes later, sharp and then those sounds reached the water's edge and changed, confused, circling in uncertainty. The exact sound of an animal whose confidence had suddenly run out. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment and listened carefully. His eyes. "Come in," he thought. "Come into the water." Holloway stepped in. Of course he did. He was not the type of man who stopped at edges. He had spent his whole life pushing through things, through protests, through logic, through the simple dignity of other human beings. And the swamp, at 7 in the morning, with 4 armed men and 2 dogs, was not going to be the thing that stopped him. Caleb heard the water shift, the splashing of men moving without awareness, without patience, forcing their way west, the dogs' voices cutting off suddenly in the way that meant they had lost the trail completely. He moved to the northern edge of the hammock and crouched behind a cypress root. He could see them now, Holloway and 4 men. The 3 hired hands and one of the old plantation workers moving in a rough line about 30 yards apart, pushing through the shallow water with rifles lifted above their heads. The dogs ran back and forth in frantic circles, useless. Holloway's white hair could be seen even in the early half-light. That straight posture unchanged, the complete certainty of his movement unchanged, but he was in the wrong channel. Caleb had made sure of that. What happened next unfolded the way things often do in the swamp. Not with drama, not with warning, but with the quiet certainty of a natural process. The first hired man found the sinkhole. 1 step on what seemed like firm ground, and he was into his waist before the second step, then chest deep, thrashing, his rifle gone. The man beside him reached for him, and they both went down together into the limestone collapse that Caleb had discovered on day 4 and marked carefully and left exactly the way he had found it, knowing that something which nearly killed him might serve another purpose later. Both men came up. Both men were breathing. They clawed their way back to shallower ground and stayed there. The second thing happened at the Moccasin Channel. Caleb had redirected it 8 days earlier. The snakes had settled into their new path by day 2. Predictable as the weather. 2 men pushing through the swamp in the half-darkness, moving fast and careless, rifles above their heads, not watching the water around their legs. They reached the channel without realizing what it was. He did not watch what happened after that. He did not need to. He listened to the voices change. Surprise first, then pain, then the sharp high tone of men who had been reminded very suddenly that they were not at the top of the order they believed they held. Both men made it to solid ground. Caleb had not planned to kill them. He had arranged it to stop them, to make the swamp loud and present and undeniable, to make it real to them, in a way that no story told back at the bunkhouse had ever made it real. It worked. Holloway was alone now. His men were behind him, injured and regrouped at the edge of the swamp, and Holloway had kept moving, not exactly out of courage, but out of the deep, built-in inability to accept that a situation had grown beyond his control. He stood in water, up to his knees, 40 yards from the hammock, looking west with his pistol drawn, and absolutely nothing to aim at. Caleb stood up from behind the cypress root. He was 30 yards away in full sight. Holloway saw him. A long silence. The swamp breathed around them. Water shifted slowly. A bird crossed the sky overhead without interest. Holloway raised the pistol. $900, said Caleb. His voice carried across the water easily. Level. Clear. The voice of a man with nowhere left to go and nothing left to lose. And because of those 2 things, he held more power in that moment than the man with the gun. That's what you said I was worth. Holloway's hand was steady. The pistol was steady. Everything on the outside of Edward Holloway was exactly as it had always been. Calm, certain, in control. But he did not fire. You can't go back, Holloway said. I know there isn't a county in this state that won't. I know, said Caleb. Another silence, longer this time. Another silence, longer this time. Caleb looked at him across the water. This man, who had held 43 lives like coins in his pocket, spent them where it was convenient, thrown them away when the numbers stopped working. This man, who had sent him into the swamp to die, and called it nature, and poured himself a bourbon, and never thought about it again. You threw me into this swamp, with my hands tied, said Caleb, and the swamp taught me everything you never did. He let that settle. It's over, he said. Your men are finished. Your dogs are useless. You're standing in water you don't understand. Alone. He paused. Go home, Mr. Holloway, whatever home means to you now. Holloway stood there for a long time. The pistol stayed raised. Then slowly it came down. Not surrender. Edward Holloway was not built for surrender, and Caleb knew it and did not need it, just the mechanical lowering of an arm that had run out of purpose. The posture of man standing among the ruins of his own certainty, with nothing to show for the damage. He turned. He walked back east. Caleb watched him until the cypress trees swallowed him, and the white of his hair disappeared into the darkness between the trunks. Then he turned and walked back to the hammock. 48 people looked at him. He looked back at them. Moses was standing, bad knee and all, with his arms folded across his chest. Grace stood beside Nora with her arms at her sides and her chin lifted, the expression of someone who had been waiting 5 years to breathe and had finally decided it was allowed. Marcus had both hands pressed flat against his own face, like he was checking whether he was real. Eli was crying quietly, without any sign of embarrassment. The infant was awake, looking up at the cypress canopy with the wide, simple attention of someone experiencing everything for the first time. Caleb stood at the edge of the hammock and felt, for the first time in 9 years, the clear weight of a silence that meant safety, not the held-breath silence of the plantation, not the listening silence of the swamp. Something different, something new. He was not a man who gave speeches. North, he said. We move north. I know the path. Through. He turned and stepped off the hammock into the water. Behind him, without hesitation, 47 people followed. They traveled 17 days through swamp and forest and river country, moving at night, resting during the day. Caleb led every step. Not one person was lost. 20 years later, in 1879, a man named Caleb operated the most reliable passage on the southern route of the Underground Railroad, a network of trails and water crossings through the Florida swamps that slave catchers had tried to map for a decade without success. They never succeeded. The swamp, as Caleb had once told Nora on a cold night with the fire burning low between them, did not give its secrets to men who arrived with guns and certainty. It gave them to men who arrived with nothing and listened.